And tonight on Geeks to Peace Theatre, Literary Influences, Part 1.
Hello, welcome to Roleplay Geeks. This is your host, Frank.
This is your token hippie, John.
Oh, and this is Jim. Jim, I'm here. I go after John.
This is Steve.
And this is Stevo, a.k.a. the other Steve.
And this week, we're going to talk about something that hopefully it has a little bit of legs, but we'll see how it goes, which is literary influences on your gaming. So I think it's fair to say the majority of people who roleplay tend to read a lot, too. And they have a sort of a rich history of it. And it kind of makes sense because if you look at the history of role-playing, basically Dungeons and Dragons being the original, it comes from a literary tradition. So it taps into the stuff of Tolkien. It taps into the stuff of, Robert Howard's Conan series. It taps into a lot of these things that have existed for literally millennia to help build its worlds. And you get the same thing when you talk about a science fiction setting like Traveller or whatever it may be. It's tapping into a rich literary tradition. So today we're going to talk a little bit about that literary tradition and specifically kind of the books that may have influenced us a lot in our role-playing journey and how we role-play and how we run the games that we role-play. So I want to talk a little bit about, let's sort of start. When you first started role-playing, what books were you reading at the time? And did that feed into your desire to roleplay? And I'm going to start with John.
So I had just really gotten into reading science fiction just before I started playing. And my first role-playing was with my cousin, Stevo. And
hell yeah.
We've never mentioned that on the podcast. So
I don't think we ever have. I don't know if anybody knows any of this. But, so I had just started reading, or getting into reading more, like specifically science fiction. Not any fantasy, just all sci-fi. And so the first one we did was actually D&D, but we didn't play any more of that for a long time. We ended up getting into Gamma World. And Stevo ran me and another friend of his named Philip on a really fun little post-apocalyptic Gamma World game. And the idea was that our characters had been in some sort of like sleep pods or whatever for hundreds of years and had slept through the apocalypse. So when we came out, we were knowledgeable about the past and the devices and how to use things. Because usually in Gamma World, the idea is that people have no idea what a laser gun is, but they figure out how to use it. They don't know what computers are. They're just learning things over because they're basically, the society had been wiped out. All knowledge had been wiped out. And it's like an almost prehistoric society again.
Wow. So, those are like some really kick-ass sleep pods. You sleep through the apocalypse? That's awesome.
Yeah.
Steve Mara and I
they're deep underground.
Steven and I need one of those sleep pods.
Take my money now.
Yeah. That's Philip Fry. Take my money. It was really kind of cool, but one of the things he introduced to us right as we left our sleep pods in the military base we were on was this. There was this huge tank thing that came rolling up to us. And it was an AI-driven tank. And it was actually called a Bolo. B-O-L-O. And it was, it actually talked to us and, asked us to present ID. And I was able to tell that we were legitimately on the base because we were military personnel because of our, I guess it had, records of us. But we couldn't do anything else with it because we didn't have any way of controlling it.
Not even play chess?
No.
Would you like to play a game?
I even tried to go down to checkers, but it said, screw you, buddy. just would not go. So I remember when we got done playing that night, I was like, man, that is really cool, dude. I mean, I was like 13, 14, so cracking voice and everything. Hey, man, that was really cool, dude. That was really, where'd you get the idea for the Molo? And he told me it was this book by Keith Laumer. And it was a series this guy had written. And so it was a bunch of stories. He said, hey, man, I got the book upstairs here. I'll let you borrow it. And I was crazy excited. I really enjoyed reading that book. And then I got into, and the funny thing was, I had just picked up a book, I think just like 2 days before, that was, I can't remember the name of it now. But it was a Keith Laumer book. And it was really neat that I was like, oh man, this is the same guy. I really liked it. This was really awesome. And so I really got more into reading. I mean, my excitement and, for just reading anything sci-fi amplified like tenfold. And I literally mean that. I could not stop reading stuff. Mom would be like, you need to get to sleep. And I'd be like, reading it at 2 a.m., 3 a.m. I'd read into the night until I finished the book. Get up in the morning and, try to go to school and then try and find more books. And it was crazy. I mean, it really became a huge deal. So I'd gotten into reading sci-fi, but once I started role-playing, the need for reading more sci-fi and to an extent fantasy just doubled, trebled, whatever. It was crazy. So yeah, I really got into it. So that book was a huge deal.
So, Jimmy, what about you?
That went on for so long, and my brain went down down so many different avenues. I forgot what we were talking about.
When you first started role playing, what were you reading at the time?
Tolkien.
Tolkien. So
yeah, it was.
Did it predate your reading or your playing? I mean,
yes. Tolkien was what I was. It was 5th grade, so I was reading Tolkien. It was the summer of, and it really sucked because we didn't have a car. The local library had a bookmobile that would come and visit, the rural areas. And
he had to take his horse to school.
That's right.
So a crayon drawing of a horse to school.
What does he look like? He's not a
Which is how he got into role playing because
he had
there's
a
horses
pig.
in D&D.
He rode his pig into town.
So they had the Hobbit in the Fellowship, and I finished the Fellowship, but the bookmobile stopped coming over the summer. And they went, so it stopped I think in June, maybe a little bit before that, and then they wouldn't come again until September. So I finished the Fellowship, and it was at the end there where Gandalf dies. I'm at a cliffhanger, and I'm like, this sucks.
Hey, spoiler alert, man.
Hey, I haven't read that yet.
So anyway, I read that book, and then Billy and I started playing our homemade sort of role-playing stuff where we use graph paper to draw the stuff out, and I covered that in a previous episode.
All you had to do was wait one summer. It's not like waiting on a George R.R. Martin novel to freaking come out. I've been waiting on book 6 for I don't know how many freaking years now, man.
6 years.
Every time they're like, hey, it'll be out in October. It'll be out in October of, this year. And then, never materializes.
He's got his money. He doesn't care.
So, Stevo, since you're talking now, let's hit you up.
It's hard to keep me from talking.
Well, you're a little different because the wave of role-playing happened a little bit later in your development. All of us were 10, 11, 12, 13, somewhere in that ballpark. Right. You were a little older, so I would
just
imagine
a wee bit.
Yeah, so I imagine you had a little bit of literary experience under your belt before you started playing.
Yeah, I had read The Hobbit around the 8th grade or something like that. And I guess I started playing D&D, I'm pretty sure, when I was about 16. There was couple of my best friends were in a church youth group, and their youth group leader, who was a guy about 25, I think, had started the game. I'd never heard of it, but he was coming to school and told me all about it. I was real excited about it, and they were invited me over to play, and I was hooked from the very first session. So, and then of course I played there, and then eventually that group morphed into a different group, and then the group that I was running at my house I would do on Sundays when I was DM and kind of learning how to do things. And so I'd probably been gaming about a year or two, because I'm pretty sure I was already in college whenever John, if you were about 13 or 14, I was probably around 18, I think.
Yeah, you were.
Something like
all
that.
Those guys were a bunch of guys that we started playing with, I think.
There's a couple guys a little older than me.
Yeah, like I think Tom was
John,
20. Yeah, I think they were
John
all
was
around 19, 20.
Yeah. So anyway, that Gamma World campaign. I mean, of course, first of all, Dungeons and Dragons very heavily influenced by Tolkien fantasy, right? I mean, the very first edition is right out of The Hobbit. I mean, almost all the monsters are there, orcs are there, goblins are there. So, I mean, if you need a novel to read to get into the game or try and understand it, at least back in those days, you read The Hobbit, and it was all there. I don't think I actually read the other books, the trilogy, until I was in college, a little bit later than that. But anyway, and I'm more of a science fiction guy. I'd already been reading science fiction. I can't tell you when I started reading science fiction. Sometimes late elementary school, junior high or something. But I had, ran across the Bolo books, and so I guess that particular Gamma World campaign you were talking about was over at summer, and so we weren't going to school or anything. And I remember, John, that was probably your first pretty heavy campaign to get into that, we played really regular and all that kind of stuff. And I used a corpse sickle scenario, which I think I had gotten from a made-for-TV movie that came out in the 1970s, the idea of somebody going into suspended animation and then waking up. These days, that's called a corpse sickle story. I didn't realize that till much later. So, I mean, it's pretty common. In fact, I used the same theme for a concept album I wrote a while back.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So, it's a common theme. But anyway, yeah, you guys, and I guess I don't know why, but I didn't really want your characters to be natives, I guess. I wanted you to already kind of have the knowledge and stuff. And so, actually you guys were aboard a starship that already put in suspended animation, and it was ready for liftoff or whatever, whenever the...
That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah.
And the apocalypse hit and all of that. So, and yeah, sure, man, I was reading those Bolo books, or had recently read them, so I threw one of those in there. And I do that all the time. I know we were playing Traveler one time here, and Jimmy, I know you were there, and John, you were probably there. But anyway, I remember I had a lift system, like to take the ships. It used a powerful laser to lift the ships from the ground up to orbit, instead of using like chemical thrusters or something like that. It was just this big, powerful laser that would lift the ships up, and I lifted that directly from Charles Sheffield novel. I do that all the time. I'll take a little thing that I think's a neat idea and put it in there, and just to give it a little bit different flavor.
So let's round everyone out first before we get into those specifics. But Steven, what about you? What were you reading whenever you first started playing, or did around that time?
And don't say cereal box.
I didn't have time to read those. I'd eat them and they were gone.
He was reading Gibbon's Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire.
Well, so I mean, what age are we talking? We're talking between...
What about 7th grade? It was 7th grade when we started role-playing, so it would have been, 11, 12, something like that?
So
12, 13, somewhere in there.
Yeah.
I was 8 when I read The Hobbit, and it was before we played that I read Lord of the Rings, so that was 5th, 6th grade, and I started on that specifically because of the Hobbit cartoon, and that kind of blew my mind. I had already been on the path of watching things like The Incredible Hulk and The $6 Million Man and Wonder Woman and shows like that.
Well, okay, so no.
Yes.
Copyright strike there, so watch out. But I think that we could do a whole nother podcast about TV and movie influences in gaming because it's a lot direct thing. So I don't want to go down that path too far.
Oh, well, I'm going to go down that path anyway. Because...
Hell yeah.
Because if it wasn't for that, I wouldn't have gotten into Tolkien the way I did between, 8 years old and 7th grade. And then after playing Dungeons and Dragons and being so taken with it as a brand and a product, when TSR started putting out books, then I immediately went to those books. And so that became my next focus that influenced me in role-playing games because I got to meet the Dragonlance Chronicles. And so then, I know, right? Love it. I was drinking out of my Raceland mug last night. I had chocolate ice cream in it.
Raceland, was that the barbarian dude?
Yeah.
I'm going to stab you in the eye.
I'm sorry, he was the halfling, right? The little halfling dude. Raceland Hoff, that was his name?
Raceland Hoff?
Raceland Hoff.
God, you're dead. Did you?
We're not back on Hasselhoff, are we?
Yeah, he's a descendant or an ancestor of Hasselhoff.
An ancestor of the Hoff.
Yeah.
From a long line of Hoffs.
Raceland Hoff.
All right. So I don't want to belabor all this conversation a bit longer, which we've gone on quite a bit. The short for me is that I actually gamed before I started reading genre literature. I had read before that a lot, but what I was reading were like biographies and how-to books and things like that. That was what interests me, and so I just started reading fantasy after that. Okay, let's talk about how we can use literary influences. Now, Steve, you've done that more than anyone I know. Have, just like you said, thrown in a literary reference, a book bit into your gaming. And I could be wrong about that because I don't know all the literature that everyone reads. My sense is in our gaming, no one else does that as prolifically as you do. The first time I can remember that, well, not the first time. The latest time I can remember that is you basically, our Call of Cthulhu's campaign was built upon a book, more or less.
Oh, so, in a way, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so how do you deconstruct the stuff you're reading to pull in an element?
So, okay. So, a couple of things in that last one. Like it used to be, I would just maybe throw in a reference, but occasionally I'll have an idea, like the idea of something, and I like that. For instance, there was I was reading a lot of Charles Sheffield. I don't know how well known he is now, but he was pretty prolific in the 90s. He's passed away now, but he was a really hard sci-fi writer.
Yeah, really good.
And he wasn't the best writer in the world as far as story necessarily, but he always had these really hard science ideas.
Yeah, they're great.
I struggled with him because of the lack of story.
Exactly, and some of his books were, a little tough. But anyway, my Traveler games in those days were definitely influenced by some of his ideas, and I would take an element of it, and again, like using the lasers, and that's not an original idea. All of this stuff is built on. Nothing happens in a vacuum. Somebody will come up with a scientific idea of using a laser to lift, a ship into orbit, right? He just incorporated it into his story the same way I did. If you've ever read Larry Niven and Jerry Pournelle's A Mote in God's Eye, it has the same concept where a bank of lasers are propelling a ship from another solar system for all of these, many years. And so the inhabitants of this colony world see it as a bright red light in the night sky for, time out of mind, because it had powered this ship for a long, long time. So anyway, that's the basis of that one. But again, it's not a wholly original concept, but I'll take a little thing like that, add it just to give it flavor. But then sometimes I'll take a bigger idea. Like in one of his novels, he had the idea that for some reason on this colony planet that had been there for generations and generations, that women began to become born less frequently. And so then over generations, women became quite rare, and it was causing the population to struggle because of that. And at this time, this planet was cut off. So in one of my Traveler games, one of the more recent ones, actually, I had you guys, your mission was to kind of reconnect colony planets. That it was sort of a dark age whenever travel between the planets had been cut off for thousands of years or hundreds of years or something like that. And I actually had you guys land on one of these planets in kind of a colonial thing, and you had women in your crew, which was really rare on this planet. And Charles Sheffield in his novel didn't really take that idea very far. The novel was actually about something else, but I actually wanted to explore what would society be like if that were true. So my story actually went in a completely different direction that you guys experienced. So usually it'll be a seed of an idea, something that I've seen the author introduce an idea, but then maybe I want to explore it in the game differently. And then a lot of times the characters themselves are creating the story, so they're going to explore it differently than even I thought of. So, I just try to set the framework for what it would be like in a realistic fashion.
So, Jimmy, do you do that? My perception is you don't, but that may be incredibly 100% a function of the types of things I read now and the types of things you read now are not the same. So I just may not be reading the stories that you're pulling from.
I will have to say for Jamie that I think that most of his stuff that when he GMs, he does that constantly. He pulls stuff from things he's read and everything. But I'll let him say it for himself. So.
Well, I think there's a lot more overlap between what you read and what he reads. So that
he's just gonna say, what was the question again?
I think John nailed it. I think both John and Frank are right. I don't know that there's a lot of overlap between what Frank reads and what I read. I think Frank's moves. I don't know what you read these days, Frank, for enjoyment, like those guilty pleasures, like science fiction or fantasy. You've been pursuing a PhD, so you've been buried in academia.
I read a lot of, this type of stories I'm drawn to are interesting stories. I don't care. Charles Sheffield is the polar opposite of what I want to read. If you have an interesting scientific idea or notion, that's neat. But if you don't have interesting stories or characters, then I have no interest in what you've got to write. Whereas a lot of the Traveler campaigns that you run, to my perspective, tends to be a bit more, this is an interesting idea. Let's explore this idea.
Yes, so like
less so that.
Yeah. I agree with you, Frank. Like at Sheffield, I had the same problem you did. It's that lack of story, right? But I do like those really interesting ideas. So I do like people like Larry Niven, who tends to be a little bit more harder sci-fi, but I think he has enough story in there to grab me and keep my attention. So the ideas I draw from a lot of different sci-fi stories for the Traveler adventures, and then I build on those. Well, long and short of it.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, John. You've said in the past on the podcast, the last campaign you ran was drawn from a book.
Yeah. It was this Deathland series by,
John Axler.
James Axler.
James Axler.
Yeah.
Right.
And
I read that first one, Deathlands.
Yeah. And I really liked the idea of the story because you could kind of, constantly move your characters around to new situations, new adventures very easily. And I liked that. I thought it was a really intriguing way to kind of get it. I thought, really it made a better kind of a game world than it probably does books. I mean, actually, books I guess are perfect for it and stuff. The big issue with it was the original author. I can't remember the real name of the author, but a number of other authors then ended up doing books under James Axler.
Yeah, I think that guy passed away.
Yeah, I think so too. And most of the authors that I read, I think up through 51 or 52 of the series. So I really like.
I'm a little surprised nobody's actually made a game out of that series. A role playing game. It'd be perfect. I mean, you're right. It's a perfect setting for a role playing game.
But what was nuts is that a lot of the authors were just horrible. I mean, I think they had interesting stories, but then there was no substance behind it. I remember this one in particular. It almost got me to stop reading it entirely, but the idea was that, I guess he liked Mad Max kind of idea of, these, cars and stuff, but instead of cars, they were pirate ships like galleons. And the idea was that there was a big engine on this galleon that was on wheels. This large pirate ship on wheels. So then they were rolling down, I think it was like maybe around Arizona, the Southwest. And they had these huge diesel engines powering really large fans, blowing the air at the sails. That was the propulsion, which anyone with any idea of how things work, that doesn't. And it was horrid. I mean, it was kind of an interesting story. I struggled through it. Because, other parts of it was like, well, why don't you just have the engine drive the wheels? That actually works. But an engine blowing a fan at sails, that doesn't work. It's
right.
Equal and opposite.
It would require way too much.
Well, it wouldn't actually do anything. I mean, for one thing, it'd be inefficient, but it actually won't do anything. The fan is producing, air movement one way in and of itself at the entire object. Anyway, it was done. So it was the exact opposite reaction. So it was just really poorly written, and so I think that's where it went down. But the other ideas in the book were great, and I tried to use those in some of the scenarios that they kind of captured in these books and stuff. And I thought it was really interesting. I think I talked about it before, was this idea of these it's just military teleporters, and there are these military bases all around the U.S. and then also in other parts of the world. And so that people would, you could get in these transmat units and then boom, you're somewhere else. It was just an interesting idea to constantly move characters along and move story along. I don't think I did a very good job of telling the story. I was just trying to get you guys as the players to kind of react to your situation and then see if I could do something with it. And I don't think I did a great job with it, but it was fun to do.
So that sort of segues nicely into a question I have, and I've left Steven on this because he's not run a campaign for us in an extremely long period of time. But I do want to touch on player aspects in a minute. But right now, if you're using a literary reference as the basis of your story, how do you keep from running out on rails? Because the book has, a beginning, a middle, and end. It has the high points. It has an arc. It has a story that it tells. And because the author has control over all the elements, they can say, well, this character chooses to do this, that character chooses that. How do you, when you've got players who never do what you expect them to do, how do you deal with that? Steve.
And specifically, you asked me about this last campaign, the Call of Cthulhu one. So, and I consider that still an active campaign, so I don't want to talk too much about some certain aspects of it. But anyway, I actually modified a scenario that was in the rule book. There's two scenarios in the rule book, and the one with Glothaki, what was it? Glothaki.
Yeah.
That actually is sort of the main bad guy of that scenario. It's a whole different thing, though. I basically took that idea of this monster in the lake and the posse in the woods, which is basically that adventure, and expanded it quite a bit, and I added some characters. So that was there, and it was creating issues, but then there's a character that I introduced you guys to, and a group of characters that I actually didn't get the idea until we had started the game, and I was reading a lot of H.P. Lovecraft for that very reason. I wanted to get the feel for H.P. Lovecraft because we're playing Call of Cthulhu, and I wanted to maybe take elements of that, little pieces of that Call of Cthulhu, just to bring in the atmosphere, so that I felt I've read most of it before over the years anyway, but so I'm reading The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, which is a very short novel by H.P. Lovecraft, one of the better ones. And spoiler alert, but it's been around for like 100 years. So in the story, it's really about an ancestor that uses magic and these means to dig up graves and things to get information, ancient information from corpses, basically dead people, and he has a way to kind of bring them back to this side and question them to learn ancient secrets and ancestors and all this kind of stuff. So, but I decided to because I've been reading a bunch of also George R.R. Martin through the past few years. I like the idea of that. It's the first time I've really seen ambiguous characters, where in a fantasy novel you don't have here's the good guys and here's the bad guys, here's the evil guys and here's the good guys, right? So in George R.R. Martin's series of novels, there really literally isn't that drawn line, right? In other words, it's more like a soap opera. Everybody has, and if you've watched the HBO miniseries, you definitely understand, or the series, you definitely understand. Everyone has their own motivations, and that's the way it is in the novels as well. So I decided to introduce some characters in this story mid-campaign that, even though appear evil, maybe are not as evil as the gods themselves and are using questionable means to get to the end, but are they actually your enemy? Maybe not. Maybe they'll be a means to an end to help defeat something, which they did in the end of this adventure, but you're not finished with them yet. They'll reappear later. And you don't know what their ultimate goals are. So in a sense, I lifted that idea of a sort of immortal guy that could use this magic ability in a very, very seemingly macabre, evil way, but maybe it actually helped defeat the monster in the long run. So even though it was repulsive, it's like, do you guys accept that? Or do you accept this friendship of this group of characters? Is it truly friendship, or is he just going to be using you? You don't know. You're very suspicious of him. But I wanted to create that atmosphere. But it's up to you, as the players, to decide that, and how you react to him is going to be a reflection of how he reacts to you. So that's not putting it on rails. The next scenario will be a situation just like what we had. If these characters reappear, it'll be up to you guys to decide of how to react to those things.
So what about you, Jimmy? Because, John suggests that you pull a lot of things from literary references that he can identify. Obviously, I don't. And as a result, there's no way for me to know the arc of the story without playing it. And we've got a long history where I tend to do jig left where you think I'm going to go right, type of interaction. So, and from a player perspective, I can sometimes identify elements that comes from a story of some sort, but not very often. So how do you keep with the story? How do you use the story idea without a rails problem?
So there was a book I read, and I can't remember the name of it now, that had, and it was just like a paragraph where it talked about an accretion disk, which I was like, well, I don't know what that is. They described it sort of in the book, but I wanted to know a little bit more. So go and look up the science behind an accretion disk. And it's essentially where two stars are pretty close together, and one siphoning off the plasma from the other star, the larger star siphoning off from the smaller star. So just with that one idea in from a literary source, I constructed a story around that. But I constructed the story in such a way to where it was the characters show up. There's an alien spacecraft that is on autopilot that's going to go in between these two stars through the accretion process, and it had shielding on it, so they decided they wanted to get on the ship. They could choose whether or not to engage in the hook of the adventure or not, and then go somewhere else, or get into the adventure by landing on the ship and then transversing the interior of the ship and figuring out, is there advanced technology, blah, blah, blah. That's all up to the player. So I don't like steal the entire story or build an entire story. I just take like that individual idea. There's an accretion disk, a ship's going to go through it, and then the players create the story from there. And you're definitely an impetus for me moving things further and further away from the on rails idea, just because I never know what you're going to do. You're going to take, and which is part of the fun of it from a game master's perspective, because when you have players that take the story in ways you never imagined, that's where the real fun is, for me anyway.
So, Stephen, you've been quiet, and now is a good time, I think, to introduce the sort of reverse side of that, because arguably early on in your campaigning career, you did this more. But, we've talked a lot about how you've got really amazing backgrounds, evolved backgrounds of your characters, and they're very deep, I think, in their conceptualization. So I'm wondering, at what level does literary influence your playing as a player, both in terms of, constructing the character, but also in terms of how you play the character once it's constructed?
In the beginning, it was everything. Studied over the word everything. But it was everything, because, I got that heavy dose of fantasy on the Hobbit, Lord of the Rings side. And then I got Dragonlance, and I got the Shannara series, and I read the Belgariad. And so in a short period of about 4 years, I consumed all of these other things that were based essentially on, the world of the Hobbit. And, and so it was everything. I spent, 3 years basically stagnating as a player, because I was so focused on having a copy of Raceland from Dragonlance that was my entire focus, and I dumped all of my role-playing energy with you guys into that. And it shaped everything in the beginning. But as I got older, and especially probably starting, when I was maybe about 28, I started reading far, far less. And so everything that I attribute to creating characters now is really related to visual media instead of the written word.
I'm just curious, Frank, what about you? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I didn't know whether you were going to follow up with Stephen, but...
No, I was actually going to ask you the question.
I wanted to find out from you, like, when you go and do your games, it seems to me, I think I have the same problem you have, is that I don't think our reading overlaps as much. So when you do your games, there tends to be a lot of political intrigue, a little bit more sophisticated on the story side of things. How do you keep from going on rails? Do you get that stuff from literature, like lift a lot of the story from it? Or is it just little sprinklings of ideas from stuff you read? Or do you just come up with it out of the blue?
Out of the blue.
So you don't have that problem with on rails?
No, I do have that problem on rails. It's horrible. It's a terrible problem. and I sympathize with somebody like George R. R. Martin and been unable to produce for a long period of time just because you find yourself in a corner that you go, well, I don't know how to resolve this problem. And I don't know how
Sure he does. He just introduces a whole bunch of 50
right.
new characters
I know.
And then totally forget about all the other characters or kill them off or,
Yeah.
I'm tired of writing about that guy.
I know how he does it, but it's not how I want to do it. But no, for the most part, most of my adventures start from a germ of an idea. What if this were true? And then I have to start working out, well, okay, if that's true, then this must be true. All right, well, that means this is probably, okay, well, how's that going to happen? Oh, well, maybe if I put this element, and that's sort of how it gets built. And the connection to literary references are minimal. And in fact, I make a conscious effort not to.
Yeah, I remember earlier you had made that comment in an earlier podcast where you said, I don't want to borrow an idea from TV or a book because you think everybody's going to be like, oh, I know about that. Yeah. I saw that. But
I know that's I know, but that's what
everybody borrows. Even first line authors borrow. Everybody borrows.
Yeah, I get that, but I worry that everyone's going, oh yeah, I read that book. Okay, so that means this is the thing, and I'm like, I don't want that to be true for anybody playing. Which is kind of dumb. Like I for some reason, it's always Jimmy in my head that gets that, and the overlap is so little that if anyone, he would be least likely.
You need to play with illiterate people.
Well, and it's hard for me.
I like the farmer in the Dale.
It's hard for me to resolve something that is not along the book. So so the thing is, what I'm interested in is stories. I'm not as interested in the technical bits. I would never throw a bolo into something. I would never put a disc in there. I would not accretion disc or whatever. I would not do that because it's not what interests me in a story. So literally, when I see this magic thing, so I know like you, Jimmy, aren't a huge fan of magic as a literary device in your gaming. That's why you prefer like a science. You tend to read science fiction and stuff. But for me, it's just magic thing. And if it's magic thing explained with science or magic thing explained with magic, it doesn't really matter because the interesting bits to me are the interaction between the characters and how that drives everything. So my games reflect that.
And when you get painted in a corner, is it players like Steve Mara that Steven that paint you in that corner?
No, it's just two reasons it happens. One is I've got players who sometimes don't do anything I can work with within that story. People are paint. I can't work with that. There's nothing in that story that I can work with. And I'm not saying it's a bad idea. I recently watched I don't know if you ever seen this show on YouTube called Hot Ones or whatever it is, where basically they interview celebrities and they eat hot wings. They're subsequently hotter. And I recently watched one with Joseph Gordon-Levitt in it, and it was kind of interesting. But they asked him about his D&D campaign, his favorite character, and he said in that his favorite character was an assassin that was chaotic evil that he and a friend of his did, and they ran for a long time. And I thought I could never run that campaign. Like, that's really interesting, but that's just not something I could ever do. I don't know how to work with that, and I don't know how to motivate those stories. So some of it is players behave and they make characters that I can't work with because I'm just too limited. And so some of it is that. And as you guys branch out in making more diverse characters, that's increasingly the source of the problem. The other source of the problem is I didn't think through the idea enough. And I know that. I ran a campaign very briefly. We did one campaign. I rather was enamored of the idea, but I think the germ of the idea was great, but the story wasn't there, so it died quickly, which is I had you guys make any character from any genre you wanted to make at all. And the idea being that you could pull in, from any of your literary or movie or Audible or whatever sources you enjoy, make a character. And I had made the basic adventure where there was these super race of aliens who brought you all in from all these different timelines and universes and all that stuff, and just to sort of see what would happen. And it was kind of a cool idea, but I had no story. And it died because I had no story. So I had nowhere to go because I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know what the story was supposed to be. So that's a real long answer to your question, which is longer than I wanted it to be. But okay, so let's bounce to Steve's things. Jimmy, let me ask you: do you use any sort of literary reference in your character creation and your character playing?
Maybe subconsciously, not consciously.
It's not It's not overtly. It's just you don't say, "Oh, I kind of like to play a character like this character in this novel."
No, I think I'm more like a lightweight Stephen when I approach my. Stephen has a way to really quickly get into like an in-depth character traits that he builds up from there. Usually contradictory aspects of the character. I sort of do that, but on a much more simplistic level. I sort of get a single idea of maybe it's a voice, like how the character would talk, or maybe it would be like, I think the last game we played live play, I had a gnome that was afraid of mustaches and grasshoppers or something like that. So it's just weird little things like that I'll throw in. And then as we play the game, I'll build on those silly little things that I put into it. And I probably picked that up from Steven because I don't know that I did that prior to playing with him. I think it's probably something I picked up from him. Thank you.
What about you? What about you, John? Do you like tap into any sort of literary concept when you're making a character, or do you just?
So for me, usually I am the polar opposite of Steven. My characters are usually just a base archetype because I just want to experience the story as we're playing it, as we're making it. Where I find that Steven probably is more along the lines of he's got a story for his character, and it's about exploring his character's story. And the issue is that it's all mostly in his head. We don't experience much. We experience some of it, but not as much as he does. And
yeah, he doesn't share it. I mean, the whole thing about the witch's broom from like whatever the farm, whatever the hell it was. I mean, that like never heard that till the podcast. So I mean, that's.
Yeah. So I still haven't heard it because I wasn't there for that one. So yeah, it is generally for me. I play just simple archetypes, and I'll flesh things out somewhat, but generally don't add a lot of anything to it. If anything, I probably do more cinematic characters, not literary ones. So
me too.
Yeah. Like Aragorn, kind of like a ranger kind of, character, or I don't, maybe that Aragorn is actually a bad one because it's not this long-suffering, angsty 14-year-old version of a ranger.
It's more or less Aragon Solo.
There, actually, that is probably the best way to put it. That is, because the next one I was going to say was Han Solo, kind of thing. And that is actually probably like dead on, Aragon Solo. And so, yeah, I don't do a lot in that respect.
Strider Solo.
I'm just I just throw a character that's kind of like very, well, most of the time when we've played, we've never really kind of done any of that with our characters, in creation. The most we usually get is, of course, it depends on what we're playing with. Like with Traveler, Drink, you kind of create a fully formed human being that is an adult in their middle of their life. Whereas D&D and some of these other games, you're playing a character who is just practically fresh out of the womb.
Leaving the farm.
Yeah, still need to be cleaned off, and hosed down. And here's your sword, little baby, and go. Like I said, leaving the farm like Luke Skywalker. So, that kind of changes how, for a D&D character, my attitude generally is like, well, there's not much there. You literally are starting off fresh. You're level 1. You can barely tie your own shoe. Mommy had to clean your face before you left because you still had jam on it, and and Dad tasseled your hair and stuff. You're like, dude, you're starting out fresh and dumb. So we've never really done anything. We're saying, okay, you've been in. Actually, now Frank has done that with your characters. You've been in the military for this king, and he's kind of given us this attitude of a bit of a story for us, and then we can kind of do a little bit more with that. But I don't really do much of that myself. I'm more of the experiencing the story rather than building my character, I guess.
I'm kind of the same way. I know, and I don't play that much. I've played more in the past year than I played for 20 years probably, and I know I'm having a difficult time filling my character out. I had one die in our Dungeons and Dragons campaign. I'm having a more difficult time filling out this character, and I don't know why. I think a lot of it is I don't understand. There's been a lot of changes since I used to play D&D in 1st edition, and now we're in 5th edition, right? So I don't understand Forgotten Realms or any of that. And fantasy's not really my thing. I'm fine with it, and I'm okay with it. I like the game. It's a lot of fun. But I know for me, because I don't understand much about the world or, what's going on, what the interplay is between different groups and some of these kind of things. And it's very complex. I think it's become much more complex than it was back in the day when we played D&D. Now, I don't really feel my place in it very much. But on the other hand, Jimmy's, and we've only played a couple of times, Jimmy's Traveler campaign, I've got a new character, and I'm just now starting to feel him out after a session or two. And I understand science fiction so much better. And again, like you said, John, in Traveler and also Call of Cthulhu, you've got this character that has a big backstory. So as you're rolling up the character, you get all of these different things. And then along with Jimmy's help, we kind of fleshed out why I'm even there and how did I get there, and all these other things that happened in my past that I've assumed may or may not play into a future story arc for me. But I've already got this sort of background that I can start building off of. I'm like, okay, I know these things about my character. I was an engineer, but I had this incident that happened, now I've got this enemy, and he explains, he comes up with the idea of who that is and what the exact circumstances are. And so as the first session or two, I sort of see how your characters are, because I'm a new guy that you guys just hired or whatever. So I'm kind of filling you all out, and it's very much like it would be in real life. I'm kind of seeing what kind of people you are. Can I trust these guys? Can I be friends with these guys? And that's how I'm filling out that character. But I have a real hard time preconceiving a character until I start playing it some.
Okay, so let's close this out a bit, because we've talked for a while, and I think statistically speaking, reading up until COVID, reading has gone down in the popular behavior. Fewer and fewer people are reading. How important do you think it is to read? Genre fiction in particular, but read in general, to both create games and play in games? Do you think it has no relevance whatsoever, or do you think it's critical, or somewhere in between?
I think it's pretty huge. For one thing, I think just reading in general, whatever you read, it kind of sounds silly to kind of say it this way, but I think it generally increases, or at least expands, your intelligence, your understanding of things in general. Almost anything you read is going to help with a lot of that stuff. So in broadening your mind, I think it really makes a huge difference. And then what you can, how your imagination, kind of pivots around ideas, and then what you can do with things and what you can come up with as a game master, or in Steven's case as a player. And so I think it's pretty, it's pretty important. I think it's a vast importance. But I have two things I really have to say, and I'll try and make it really quick. So one is I just want to give people an impression of Jamie when he was younger. So I remember when we were talking about,
Jimbo.
Yes. Jimbo.
He actually had hair.
Yes, he had hair. But he was also a dick at times. And let me tell you exactly why. So, when we were first talking about, like getting into role-playing and the books we were reading, and this is a Tolkien versus everything. So, he was all into Tolkien. I read Tolkien. I read the Hobbit. Blah, blah, and I never read it. I didn't read any Tolkien until probably just maybe 10 years ago.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
I never read.
Same here.
And so
I read The Hobbit maybe 3 years ago, but I read Lord of the Rings maybe 15 years ago.
Yeah. And so, but I remember I was talking about, I said, oh man, and this is way back when we were really pretty young and talking about, books we liked and stuff. And I said, well, I got into this guy, Keith Laumer, from my cousin, introduced me to the thing and stuff. And I was like, yeah, I guess that's an alright book for kindergartners or something, yeah. And I swear to God, that's what he said, He said, it was like, you want to read like, real authors and stuff like Tolkien. But he literally said like, I guess it's alright for kids.
I stand by my statement.
Huh?
You stand by my statement.
By it. All right. We'll see what happens.
And the second thing?
Time. Okay, and so the second thing is Stevo rather, specifically kind of said something along the lines of, or no, Jimmy I guess did, about Sheffield being like this kind of like hard sci-fi. And so some people that we had worked for, during one meeting and stuff, something came up about, some books we were reading. And I think I said something about reading some Charles Sheffield and stuff. And I was like, well, what kind of stuff does he write? And I said, well, it's hardcore sci-fi. And they looked at me really funny. It's like, hardcore, is it porn? I'm like, no, it's hard sci-fi. They're like, look, hardcore sci-fi makes it sound like it's porn. I'm like, it's advanced, it's basically very theoretical stuff. Like we said, it's not a lot of story sometimes.
It's not Robert Heinlein.
Yeah, well, so it's not, it's very idea-driven writing, not, and speculative, sci-fi and not so much story and characters and everything. So, but I don't know. I just thought that was really funny because we kept bringing up hard, and I kept thinking, oh, hardcore sci-fi, and this whole thing about hardcore porn. So sorry, I just had to say that. So get that off my chest.
So, Jimmy, what's your thoughts on the question, which is, how critical is literary, particularly genre literary reading, to your ability to play?
I think it's probably pretty important. Basically what you're doing is telling a story. And if you've ever listened to any authors, say Stephen King, for example, a very prolific author, talk about the importance of reading and developing as a writer, it's invaluable and necessary. So if you're going to be telling stories, I think it's... I'm not going to say it's impossible to do it without ever reading a book, but I'd say it helps out quite a bit. I would say it's necessary. So I think that's...
I know. For me, at least, I think... I don't know so much... I think it's very difficult when you... I suppose somebody could get by... No, I'm just talking about a player perspective, but even maybe for a game master, could get by, just based on things they've seen on television or movies. But I will say that, for instance, I know I have a real good friend who loves fantasy but never reads science fiction. Never. I mean, he's read, Brandon Sanderson and all those guys, and I mean, he can name all the, contemporary fantasy authors out there right now, and he reads it constantly. Never reads science fiction, no interest. So it's really hard for him to get into science fiction because he just doesn't understand it. He doesn't understand some of the very kind of basic. I mean, I know the elements of genre fiction are almost all the same between science fiction and fantasy, and I guess it depends on the type of science fiction game you're running, but I tend to run ones that are a little bit idea driven sometimes. I mean, I try to have a good story as well. And, it's just what we consider and take for granted a concept of relativistic speeds, for instance. He doesn't understand. He's not into science. He doesn't watch or read science fiction. It's not his jam. So, I think from that point of view, I think you almost have to be into the genre that you're wanting to play, or otherwise you're just totally not going to get it. I've seen that before when we were young, trying to get different people into playing, whether it was their thing or not. Now, somebody may be able to get into Call of Cthulhu or a different type of horror game, because those are the ones that are based most in reality. And, you can make it a modern day adventure. That would probably be something that just about anyone could relate to if you make it stranger on a very, very slow scale. Because everybody's watched a horror movie, I would assume. Nearly everyone's seen one at least once or twice. But when it comes to science fiction and fantasy, and could be part of my problem of really getting into playing this elf character I have in our Dungeons and Dragons campaigns, I really don't read much fantasy anymore. I've read all the George R.R. Martin stuff, Song of Ice and Fire, Game of Thrones, but it's not my go-to, not typically.
Steven, you probably have the strongest literary background of any of us, having a degree in English and all that sort of stuff. So, how critical do you think it is to being able to game well?
0. And I have a very specific reason for saying that. The oral tradition predates written traditions by God knows how long. And people have been set up to absorb, process, and tell stories without the written word for far longer than we've had the written word. So I believe that if someone has access to a visual medium, whether that is what people produce on television in live action series or anime or art or anything like that, I believe that the absorption of the facets of those stories and the characters that are within them is in many ways more profound than consuming them through reading. And it also has to do with how people learn. Yes, Jimmy?
Can I change my answer? I want that answer.
Actually, I disagree with your premise, to tell the truth.
Well, let him finish.
I'm sure you all do.
Not me.
Yeah,
I agree.
Because to say that the written word is required for the intellectual expansion to be able to be creative and to be able to produce these kind of wondrous things in our imagination, in a lot of ways is kind of elitist. There are and have been peoples all over the world who've given us the basis for all of our stories, all of our literary traditions, the hero's journey, all of that, who started out not having access to the written word. The written word made it much easier to pass these stories on down, and it gave people the ability to be these kind of, historians of a tribe or, truth sayers and whatnot. It broadened the ability of people to carry this knowledge amongst themselves. But it didn't replace it. Next.
Yeah, the reason I disagree with you is I think probably the written word came before, written word, more like pictograph, came before oral traditions of any sort. I'd say probably very, very, very early on, you had, two people sitting around the fire, and about all they could do was, just to get each other's attention, maybe. And and maybe just draw like, pantomiming eating and then drawing, in the dirt by the fire, their version of a bison or something like that. I think that was, and technically that would be the first written word, and probably came before actual speech is what I'm getting. I'm just being contrarian, so just to avoid.
I see that because the processing of imagery is different than the processing of language.
Right. So just to be contrarian, I just had to bring that up.
Thank you, Mr. Contrarian.
You're very welcome.
So what I would say to that is that I think that different mediums lend themselves to different stories, and one of the great things about the written word is it's cheap. So you can invent amazingly robust things in a few hundred words that would cost millions of dollars to translate into a visual medium. And therefore, I think there are stories that people tell using the written word that aren't being told in the visual medium. So I think that I will agree with Stephen that you don't need it. It's not necessary. You can have a wonderful time role-playing. You can enjoy role-playing. You can make very interesting, compelling stories using role-playing and play in very diverse ways. But I think it taps into potential palettes that you don't realize. That it is just another dimension of storytelling and story presentation. There are elements that are in the written word that I don't think would make it into our games. The ukulele disc that Jimmy puts in.
Points, Frank.
Actually, there's a Star Trek: The Next Generation,
right? But I mean,
episode that has that. So
But I'm just saying that I'm not sure that everyone would pick that little element out of a 10-second shot in a movie or a television show and say, well, that's intriguing. What if I built something around that? Some people will, absolutely. But I'm just saying with the written word, sometimes things can pop out in different ways than would be in a visual medium. And that's assuming we treat all visual mediums identical. So, for example, something that Steve and I diverged greatly on is he draws a lot of inspiration from anime. I don't like anime, so I don't actually consume any of that visual medium. So, that's a whole dimension that I've shut myself off from for reasons that aren't really we're talking about. But it is things you can do in anime because drawing something is a hell of a lot cheaper than making it in special effects. So, in the continuum, there's different visual mediums. Now, Jimmy had something he wanted to say, and I keep.
I just want to amend that. I want to go with Steven's answer and then your footnote, and I'm good.
That is I was going to say that there is a catch-22 now because of our progressions as advanced civilizations who are killing themselves, but advanced civilizations, that you can't produce these visual things to draw these ideas upon without the written word anymore. So there is this catch-22 of a cycle. But if you were, just someone who didn't have exposure to the written word and was consuming things visually in our modern world, I believe you could be quite a good storyteller, even if you couldn't do the writing or the language.
And an awful lot of our science fiction stories are drawn from linguistic traditions that, most of us don't know. So if you're pulling from Chinese or Japanese and you don't have that linguistic ability, you wouldn't be able to read those stories or anything like that unless they were translated oftentimes in a visual medium. So, there's a lot. You're right. There's a cycle and a feedback mechanism. The best example of this for role-playing is The Expanse, right? Expanse starts as a role-playing game. It's something that somebody invented for a role-playing game, and that translates into a written medium, and then that in turn translates into a visual medium. So it's and which thousands of people are using in their gaming. So there is a feedback mechanism that it's a little hard to disentangle what's what. Stevo, I'm sorry, you had something.
I just wanted to add that, I don't want to sound, all. I just wanted to add, I didn't want to sound all elitist, as Steve put it, saying, "Oh, you have to be, well read to run a great game or whatever." I mean, certainly you can absorb your media however you like, but I think the written word, I've read so many great stories and short stories and things like that in science fiction in particular, that the ideas almost require a foreknowledge of other things. Again, everything builds on everything else. So it's almost like you have to enter that world at a certain level, that you have to take some things for granted, some tropes, as it said, for instance. But if you're not into that, if you're not into science fiction at all, then you have to kind of start at the Star Wars level. And there's nothing wrong with Star Wars, right? I mean, we all I had to kick a cat, sorry. No, I didn't kick a cat, for real. Just shoot the cat. So
you shot the cat? You're a monster.
All right. So anyway, but even how many times have you guys read a book or read a story, whether it's fantasy, science fiction, or anything else, and then Hollywood got a hold of it and they turned it into the exact same story you've seen 1,000 times, and then you're like, "There's nothing like this in the book." The story elements are completely different. And they just maybe pull some of the names and the background and a couple little things from it. I mean, Starship Troopers comes to mind as being a perfect example of that. I mean, completely different than the book.
The Running Man.
The Running Man, another excellent example. I mean, not that those aren't fun movies in their own right, but at the same time, I know you're not a Schwarzenegger fan, so...
I love Schwarzenegger, but The Running Man sucked.
But anyway, all I'm saying is if you try to introduce someone to a genre that can be complicated, like fantasy or science fiction, and they're not into that, then it's going to be harder for them to understand what's going on, because we already understand the tropes because we've read this stuff and we've watched this stuff. That's all I was saying about my point. I'm not saying that, And again, if you're going to introduce someone to role-playing game, maybe introduce them using something, really simple, like a Call of Cthulhu game or something, or a horror game, where everything's based in reality, and then you slowly kind of break that reality.
I was going to say Call of Cthulhu is simple.
From a player's perspective, I think it could be very simple. You just go through your normal daily life. You can imagine that you're an investigator, private eye, or something. We've seen that 100 times in TV, right? Even if you're not a reader. But then as things, to really roll out a good horror story, you have to break things, you have to have a slow build to do it effectively, I think.
I see. I agree with that. And keep in mind, kids, Steve isn't saying that reading's not important. Steve is saying, please read. Expand your mind. Please, for the love of God, read. However, what I said before.
If you ever get into reading and really get into it and ever run across a story that you think is just the greatest thing you've ever read, you'll be hooked for life. Because to me, it can't compare to a visual medium ever.
So I want to talk about a couple things, hopefully quickly, but I would suggest to people to even think outside of genre fiction, and some of the ideas can be incorporated in various ways. I'm fairly fascinated with an author by the name of Walter Mosley, and he tends to write kind of detective novels, for lack of a better term. And any Walter Mosley fans that happen to be listening to this are probably just screaming at their hyperlinks that I boiled it down to that. But he writes a really interesting series of books, and there's a bunch of stories by another set of stories, Hap and Leonard, which have turned into a TV show that I rather enjoy the way those stories work, and I enjoy the cadence of those stories. And that cadence can be brought in, even though it has nothing to do with science fiction or fantasy or horror or wherever it may be. So you can reach outside genre and say, well, what are the interesting things that come out of that? As a character, is there an interesting character in there that I can mimic and make my Strider solo, by mixing things with other things? So don't be afraid to do that. If you find inspiration from there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, and it's a great way. But I also say that one of the challenges you have with that as a game master is you have to be a little bit prepared for how to communicate that to your players. So one of the things we've talked a lot about on this podcast is the murder hobos that we tend to play. And I think it's fair to characterize it's definitely my interpretation of Jimmy's opinion of that is a little bit of frustration that maybe he wants to do something a little different, but his players keep murder hoboing. But some of that is maybe a function of the genre fiction we're thinking of. So, if you're thinking of Firefly or you're thinking of something like that, murder hobo is the logical conclusion, logical direction to go with that, or a more logical direction to go with that. And if you're trying to tell a Charles Sheffield story, that's not appropriate, right? So you have to set the scene as a game master a little bit to understand this is the tone we're going for, and it can really have a huge impact on how we play as players too. So Stevo's recent Call of Cthulhu campaign, I hate horror. I don't like any. I've only seen 2 horror movies in my life all the way through, and I hated them both so much. And they're considered to be, the atypical of their genres. There's nothing in a horror movie or I've read one horror book and I hated it. So there's nothing in there because of what they're going for from a storytelling perspective that I like at all. So I avoid it like the plague. But I very much enjoyed the Call of Cthulhu campaign because it allowed me to try to think about how to play in a different way as an investigator, as a much more deliberate, slow build, step through, not whip out my sword and go at it type of player. And it's been a lot of fun for me. So even though I don't like the genre and I know nothing about it really, you can have fun, but you have to set that expectation. So if you're tapping into literary genres, and even if there's subgenres of genre fiction, please communicate that to your players. It only helps make all of it better. Okay. Any last thoughts on this topic before we wrap it up?
I could probably talk about it all day, so we probably better just stop it here.
Okay. So if you've got any thoughts on this topic, please feel free to hit us up in the contact information. Come along in a second.
That's all we have for this week. Thanks for spending time with us. Please leave a review and comments wherever you listen. It helps others find the show. If you have topic suggestions or would like to get in touch, you can reach us at roleplaygeeks@roleplaygeeks.com. Head on over to the website for an archive of all our previous shows, as well as links to all our social media channels. Thanks again, and we'll catch you next week.